A lot to cover today, so why don't we get started? Start with good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you again for joining us today for our Future Feed Explorer series webinar entitled Why is Access Control So Darn Important for CMMC? Today's webinar is being recorded and all attendees will receive an email with a link to the recording. You can also enter questions into the Zoom platform, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation, and we'll send a separate email with answers to any questions we aren't able to get to. Today's webinar is sponsored by FutureFeed and by ISI. FutureFeed is the leading cyber GRC platform used by the defense industrial base to achieve and maintain CMMC compliance readiness. At FutureFeed, we're committed to securing our nation's supply chain from our adversaries by creating an affordable, collaborative IT management platform. ISI delivers integrated compliance, cybersecurity, and IT solutions purpose-built for small and medium-sized businesses in the defense industrial base. With expert-led CMMC support, outsourced AFSO services, and security control software, ISI helps defense contractors stay secure, audit ready, and contract eligible, eliminating complexity with a single accountable partner for compliance, security, and operational readiness. Well, the Future Feed Explorer series was created to arm defense contractors with the information that you need to understand to address the requirements of CMMC. And throughout the series, we're going to share critical insights from industry experts and best practices for achieving and sustaining CMMC compliance. Equally important, we're going to share the why behind the CMMC program and its requirements. And while the focus of many organizations is on receiving a CMMC certification, the real objective must be ensuring their ability to protect the sensitive information with which they're entrusted and which they create. And CMMC can't be approached as a checkbox exercise. It needs to be viewed as a corporate and as an individual responsibility to secure our nation's supply chain from our adversary. Today's webinar focuses on two of the most important components of an integrated information security program and within NIST 800-171 and CMMC. And those are access control and identity management. In fact, the access control domain is the first domain your C3PAO team will validate during your assessment, and it's the domain that they're likely spent the most time examining. And so today we're going to focus on why the protections afforded by these two domains are so important. We'll explain the specific requirements in NIST 800-171 for access control and identity management and provide guidance on how to address those requirements. So my name is Stuart Itkin, and I am the CRO and Chief Security Evangelist at FutureFeed. Much of my career has centered on supply chain and vendor risk management and regulatory compliance. I formerly served as a member of the CMMC Standards Working Group and participated in the establishment of the CMMC accreditation body. I'm a founding board member of MSPs for the Protection of Critical Infrastructure and a director of the CMMC Industry Standards Council. And joining us today are Amy Williams and John Nolan. Amy Williams serves as the VP of Compliance and Education at FutureFeed and as a member of the Cyber Guild Advisory Council. Amy is a nationally recognized expert in cybersecurity compliance and brings extensive experience in CMMC assessments and NIST 800-171 implementation. And she has brought clarity, integrity, and excellence across the defense industrial base. John Nolan serves as the Vice President of Compliance for ISI Enterprises, where he oversees the compliance program and operations for the company's managed service provider operations. As an IT professional, John has held roles in engineering, cybersecurity, compliance, and project management over the past 23 years, and the last 10 years focused on the Department of War and the DIB, where he became engaged with CMMC at its inception. And along with his team, John has overseen over 150 CMMC gap assessment and remediation projects and has personally assisted C3PAO candidates on their journey to become certified assessors. So, Amy and John, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Stuart.
Good. So let me start with a story to kind of help frame the importance of this. And in 2025, North Korean nationals Kim Kwon-jin Kang Tae Bak, Jong Pong Ju, and Chang Nam fraudulently posed as IT workers using stolen or false personally identifiable information, and they were subsequently hired by US-based companies. They submitted fake identities and credentials to land jobs, then used their access to steal sensitive information from the victim firms. More than 100 US companies have hired individuals who've used stolen or fabricated identities to pose as remote IT workers. They were hired under the pretense of being US or third country nationals and were able to successfully pass background checks and onboarding processes despite being in North Korea. And to their US employers, they appeared as US based remote workers thanks to local laptop farms, VPNs, and artificial intelligence. And while in fact they were working remotely from a comfortable DPRK facility in North Korea. And I should point out that some of the 100 victim companies did the minimum required to be able to check the boxes that access control and identity and management had been addressed. And they were compliant, but apparently they weren't secure. But we're going to leave that for a topic of another discussion. What's important is that managing who or what has access and what they have access to is critical to information security. And one last critical point. Every incident, every data breach starts with some form of unauthorized access. So let me ask Amy, in order to guard against or to prevent unauthorized access, we need to understand the common strategies or the techniques that bad actors use to gain access. So can you talk to us a little bit about what are common, maybe the less common ways that bad actors gain access to our information and our systems?
Absolutely. Thank you, Stuart. So 1,000 years ago, I was a professor in cybersecurity, and in talking about holistic cybersecurity programs, I'd always start with an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So your grandmother was correct about that. And of course, the best thing is to not let bad things get in to begin with, but you also have to have within your program the ability to detect bad things when they're there and to correct bad things when they're there. But the prevention, the access control is super critical. And so, some of the key ways that attackers use to get in and around access controls are, first of all, they start with recon. And recon is any sort of open source intelligence, like Google is a good starting point, LinkedIn, any sort of social network information that you have. And then beyond that, there's the dark web is cheap and readily available for things like reuse passwords. That's still a really big problem. Please don't reuse your passwords, people. It's a very dangerous thing, and it's a fairly common practice to reuse your password that you use for work, for your work email, for example, to for anything else associated with work. And that's just a really bad practice because if it's out there in one place, then the bad guys are going to try to reuse it. Misconfigurations is another common thing that attackers look for using common scanning tools. So any sort of externally facing applications without multi-factor authentication are fair game. Outlook web access without MFA is super risky and dangerous. And any sort of application that has default admin credentials still associated with it. So those are important things to look at. So any sort of social engineering, phishing, smishing, vishing, impersonating executives with help desk or with the police, watering hole attacks. So there was a fairly famous attack recently, not so recent, within the last 5 years, against a defense supply chain where really smart engineer wanted to take classes at an educational facility. He used his work email because he wanted to get reimbursed for it, and then he used his work password because that's we're preconditioned to use the password that goes with the email. And the training site didn't have good security on their credentials, and someone was monitoring that, knowing that a lot of engineers use that particular training site. And then it was really easy to get into that person's email because of the reused password and because their email didn't have MFA. Then they were off and running and skipped like 3 steps in the supply chain up to almost a prime contractor within a couple of leaps. Not a whole lot of damage was done that we know of, but that's how easy this happens just from a simple misconfiguration. are from social engineering combined with misconfigurations. Lateral movements, once an attacker is in the system, then going for anything that has privilege access. So another reason why it's really good to lock down privilege access. We tend to inflate privilege access because it makes life easier for us to do so. Um, but that's, following a strict RBAC and having MFA for access to any sort of sensitive information is super helpful. And then spear phishing. Spear phishing can be really effective if it takes place from outside your network. But as I was speaking through some of these, if once an attacker gets into your network and they've got access to a legitimate email box, then if they send attacks from that email box, there's no way to tell that it's an attacker because it's coming from a legitimate network. And then once inside the network, exfiltrating CY and other sensitive information. That's the golden key. So get access, escalate to privilege, from privilege, collect everything you can, get out of the system. That's a fairly common game plan.
You're on mute, Stuart.
Sorry about that. I was just going to ask Amy. So, what is the cost of weak access? What are some of the consequences that a company can experience for allowing unauthorized access?
That's a lot more expensive to correct a mistake than to prevent it from happening in the first place. So you can have loss of reputation, you can have loss of contracts, you can have loss of customers. So there's, a lot of really terrible things can happen once that sensitive information has been exfiltrated. So it's best to keep that from happening as best as you can.
And if I may, one thing, Amy, you said that I think is really important to nail down, because I talked to a lot of contractors that, the replies, and we're a small group. We do something very little, and, we're not of any interest to any attackers, but that vertical mobility that you mentioned is a key thing to understand, is that they're not going to go after Boeing or Lockheed because they know they're spending tons of money to keep themselves safe. They start at the bottom of the chain and work up, because it's more likely they'll find a gap. So, that thought process kind of reversed in who they're targeting in that way.
Absolutely, John. It's really clear that the smallest companies within the defense supply chain are the number one targets because they're not expected to have a lot of interest and capability around cybersecurity. They're engineering companies that actually create the secret sauce that goes into making the larger product really successful. And it's that secret sauce that's more valuable than it's super valuable. It's that the secret sauce is valuable, and then the access into the supply chain is super valuable.
100%.
Yeah, I know that former Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, Ellen Lord, had referred to the small contractors in the defense industrial base really as the soft underbelly, and pointing out that the Chinese didn't carbon copy the F-35 by stealing one set of blueprints from Lockheed Martin. They developed it by stealing CUI from hundreds of suppliers that were in that supply chain. So, I mean, now that we've got an idea of how a bad actor can potentially get access in an unauthorized way to information to a system, John, how can access be controlled? How do we ensure that only people who are authorized have access, and that they only have access to the information that they're entitled to as a function of their role or their function?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the key phrases that you'll hear throughout CMMC, NIST 800-171, and really cybersecurity in general is the principle of least privilege. Making sure that you're evaluating the access people need, because it's easy just to give people access to share. Well, I don't know if they're going to work on this project next week or need this file next month, and that's really not an effective way to do that. You really need to understand where people need access, and that goes for standard users and administrators, and really curtail what they're getting down to the specifics. Now, past that, it's all down to role-based access controls. That's how that happens. This access control, the title of this webinar, why is it so darn important, is these are the keys to your house, to your environment, and this is the lock on the door that's going to keep people out. So putting in a well thought through and a well developed and matured role-based access control methodology, and using trusted tools like Microsoft or Google Workspace and their associated access control modules is definitely the best way to go. Some of the notes you see here on the screen are things that people overlook, like creating security groups. One of the big reasons a lot of these things don't get followed is because of the administrative overhead. If you're giving permissions at a file and folder level, then not only do you have a lot more to administer, but you're also more likely to make a mistake and somebody won't have what they need, or they'll have a little too much. So by creating security groups that are specific to your company and are broken down to the most, I'll say, logical level, is really the best way that you want to go. It's easy to maintain, it's easy to understand if it's named properly, and it's easy to keep going and lock down from it. From there, you would use those groups to assign permissions to basically everything that's interacting with your environment, depending on how it's set up. If you're using things like SSO, you can usually migrate those in. But if, let's just, for the argument's sake, let's say you're mostly using a GCC or GCC high environment. You can control all of your SharePoint access that way, and you want to use that same methodology through each of your environment modules or your external service providers, however you want to term it. That should have a similar methodology across the board. And then based on the user's purpose in your environment, their job duties, their job details, that's what's going to decide what group they get added to. Another key thing I always have to mention, because I spend a lot of time in audit, so I know this comes back through, is documentation of those changes. I know we hear documentation all the time, but when you're adding permissions, when you're adding users to these groups, it's key that those changes are reviewed, approved, and documented. So you don't want to just add a bunch of people into a group. You want to make sure that you have a ticket, if you have a ticketing system or some other method of documenting those changes in your system. That's going to leave everybody with very detailed, very leveled permissions that's easy to manage and easy to maintain.
And we hear a lot, John, about zero trust architecture. I mean, how does zero trust architecture, fit into the discussion of guarding against unauthorized access?
Yeah, so I mean, the best way to explain that is zero trust. We'll use that locked door analogy again. If your door is open and you have a bouncer in front of it, let's say, that's open trust. Everybody can come in, but you're looking to see who's coming in to see. Know you can come in. But zero trust is that door is always locked unless you just made a direct key to it. So you're creating exceptions to a complete block policy. And it is applied in different ways across the board, but at its base, that's what zero trust means. You're not trusting anything until you prove that it has a purpose in your environment, and then you're letting it in one by one.
Oh, I really like that simple visual explanation, John. I haven't heard it described that way before, but that's very elegant.
I'm a simple person.
No, it's helpful. That's a very effective visual.
It does make a lot of sense. And again, back to the earlier comment about compliance versus security, the more layers that we can put on, to Amy's point, the more prevention, so that we don't need to worry about the very costly cure. And I know we've been talking about people. And it's not just employees, Amy, that have access, and that access needs to be protected, but it's also third parties, it's processes that act on behalf of authorized users, it's authorized devices, it's other systems. And can you explain what we mean by some of these? I know people get a little intimidated when they read Alpha through Foxtrot and 3.1.1. But can you explain kind of what we mean by those, and how can they be exploited and how can they be protected?
Yeah, so a handful of examples for third-party credential access. It's, when you think about getting compliant with CMMC or anything else, and you look for third parties that are going to be able to support you, and everybody says, well, it's really important to vet those third parties. It's because anyone who has access to those third parties has access to a lot of important companies, a lot of important information. And in the CMMC community, we talk a lot about having to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent if you store, process, or manage CUI in the cloud. And why is that so important? And why do they have to follow CMMC level 2? Well, it's because they are now protecting really important federal secrets. And so access to those third parties means access to a lot of companies have sensitive data. And so it's really important for those third parties to not only understand the kind of attack strategies that are used on every company, but the kind of attack strategies that are particularly used on them as third parties with access to a large number of other organizations. And so things like compromised vendor credentials, everyone remembers the big attack on Target through the HVAC system that gave them access to 40 million credit card credentials as a result of having a non-segmentation of the network between HVAC and the point of sale system for Target. A single managed services provider has their credentials set, can grant access to dozens of client environments simultaneously. So it's really important that those keys to the kingdom are well protected. I've got a handful of other fairly geeky examples here. I'll just go through a couple of them. OAuth and delegated token abuse. So, sending a fish to grant permissions to something like read mail or write access to a Google Workspace or a Microsoft Workspace, protecting your service accounts and your API keys from theft. Developers accidentally and enthusiastically commit AWS access keys and service account JSON files and Stripe APIs when they're just trying to help other people in environments like GitHub. And they, cut and paste things and don't realize the sensitivity of some of what they're including in those environments. Supply chain software injection. Everyone remembers, or maybe remembers, the SolarWinds attack in 2020, followed by the Kaseya attack in 2021. So in both of those cases, the attackers injected backdoors into software updates that went out to a ton of clients with SolarWinds. It went out to 18,000 customers, and a bunch of those were federal contractors. So those are really scary moments in time. Adding malicious DLLs to run alongside legitimate executables, privilege escalation via integration. So we have a lot of API integrations now, Salesforce, Jira, Slack, ServiceNow, and there's usually a pretty broad set of there's a broad set of data that's given that you give access to through those API integrations. And so anybody who can, figure out a way to write along those permissions can have access to some very sensitive data. And then finally, token theft and session hijacking, which is malware designed to steal browser stored tokens, which is now a really popular way to get access to information in a lazy way. And before I move on, I just want to point out that these are all CMMC numbers that on the right-hand side of the screen, and they're all controls that are related to protection of your data, and they are directly related to protecting these kinds of attacks. So I really get upset when I hear that compliance does not equal security. It's true. Compliance does not equal security, and CMMC is only related to confidentiality. But I bet you cannot find a company in the ecosystem who is compliant with CMMC, who is not more secure from being compliant with CMMC than they were before that effort.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that that CMMC conformance will certainly make you better than you were. But organizations need to really ask the question, am I truly secure? Can I be doing more to protect access to my systems, more to protect access to the information that I have? And John, in talking about people and non-people access. Let's talk specifically about NIST 800-171 and the access control, or the AC domain. So can you kind of give us kind of some familiarity and where some of the things that we've talked about can be found within the AC domain?
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's scattered through, and then when you do go through or it's proliferated through, I should say, AC and even IA, and that's really the core purpose of those is controlling these humans and non-human access. I think that second part is really important because a lot of people think access control means users, and it does, but it also means your service accounts. So if you have like a backup system, for instance, anything that needs access to your environment, that's more than likely going to have a service account that needs to be treated the same way. And then the other that people forget a lot is your devices. They also log into this, factor into this as well. So you start with the basics, limiting system access to authorized users. Who are your authorized users, documenting them as well. The one thing I think a lot of people don't have in preparation for the AC domain and the IA domain as well is an access control matrix. So having something put together that defines not just who your authorized users are, but the different types of authorized users you have, what they can do, what they can't do, and have that go across the board for all of your different modules of your environment, whether it be a different software solution or a secondary cloud environment. Limiting system access to authorized processes. Again, that's going to be things like your backups and other software tools that need to interact directly with your environment. These are just as, I don't want to say open to attack, but these are just as likely to be attacked as your user accounts, and they can do just as much damage if they're not watched. So they are equally important. And so it's really important to get your brain around that idea that, authorized users isn't just users, it's users, services, devices across the board. So enforce least privilege. And this is, outside of actually having usernames and passwords for everybody, I think this is the next most important thing in my mind is that, making sure that your user accounts mean something other than I'm just getting in the building. If any of you have a physical office space, then you'll be familiar with least privilege because you likely have a key to get in the door, but some of you may not have a key to the HR room or the accounting room or the server room. And it's the same thing in your cloud environment. These same things apply. So, your standard user doesn't need access to the Intune admin portal, for instance, or they might not need full access permissions to a SharePoint site. Making sure those are applied uniformly and correctly goes back to that first slide I spoke on. Separation of duties is a very important one that I think also gets not overlooked, but I think it's hard for some companies to accomplish, especially smaller companies or companies without a big IT presence, because this really makes sure that somebody's watching the watchers in a way. You don't have the same person pulling audit logs that's configuring the audit logs, for instance, or checking audit logs, I should rather say. So making sure that those key duties are assigned to separate individuals, to make sure that, we all want to trust everybody in our system, obviously, but we're here because that's not reality. So making sure the proper things are segmented so that you can take that factor out of it and you can have that separation to ensure bad things don't happen by having all your eggs in one basket, essentially. Controlling remote access is a huge one. So a lot of companies are, they want to be flexible with their users. We're a mostly, if not, almost entirely hybrid world now for the most case in our types of industries. And, that with that comes remote access. Now, the nice thing is many people have gone to a fully cloud infrastructure. But remember that even that is remote access. So if you have an IT group that is working with you that needs to remote in and work on your computer to help you troubleshoot something, or you're remotely accessing a cloud server, this is data in transit. And CUI can be part of that data in transit. Actually, it usually is. So making sure that you're not just securing, but aware of all remote connections and preventing against unknown is the heaviest part of that entry. You want to make sure that people aren't going out and using log me in unless it's approved in what you use. They shouldn't have the ability to go out and pick whatever remote access tool they want to use. And the last one is probably one of the biggest ones that we see these days, especially with subcontractors that employ 1099s or have people with different, very different levels in the environment. And that's managing mobile device usage. We all use our mobile devices to check our email, but that needs to be protected. Now, the crux is that if you've ever presented to a staff group the idea of putting monitoring software on their personal device, you'll know it's not a pleasant experience. But there are some really good solutions out there that kind of balance the table between company issued devices, and BYOD. Microsoft's company portal is one we use a lot. It allows you to put a segmented boundary on the device, a personal BYOD device that somebody's using, to keep their personal data separate and safe, while also still maintaining the security and integrity of your corporate data. So making sure that you have those solutions out, you have those options available to your staff, and then also making sure that your environment, and this is the big one that most people miss, is blocking outside access from unknown devices and users. Web access email, OWA, it's something everybody's familiar with. And sometimes you don't have your laptop, or you're at the in-laws and you just want to use a laptop to check your email. You can't really do that, because one of the key AC requirements is that all devices accessing the environment are authorized and identified. So configuring your cloud environment or your even on-prem environment to disallow access from unknown devices and users, really puts into light the need to manage those mobile device accesses, because you'll need everybody to get access from out in the world, in most cases.
And John, you did such a great job of explaining zero trust architecture. Do you have as a simple explanation for the term processes acting on behalf of authorized users? I know it's a question that's been posed to me by a number of people that we've worked with.
Yeah, so it's really just think of any automated task that a system is doing for you. Now I'm struggling to think of an example, but if you have a solution or software, in today's automation heavy world, we have a lot of solutions and software that do that. So if there's a user type action, like, sending an email, installing a program, updating Windows updates would be a good one. So if you have managed Windows updates, then you have a process acting on behalf of a user. It's installing those updates on behalf of you, something that you used to do manually. So that's really where that comes down. The best way to think about it, I'd say.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And I know while we're talking about, again, guarding against unauthorized access, I mean, access control is it's only a part of the equation, ensuring that only those that do have access to our information and systems. And so when it comes to protecting CUI, access control really goes hand in hand with identity management. And I think that was kind of the core of the example that I started with. And so, really, in fact, identity management and access control, they're generally referred together as IAM, or the term identity and access management. And Amy, can I ask you to dig into the why, what, and how of identity management? Kind of give us an explanation of what it is and why it matters. And I think the other point is, why do some organizations find it so difficult in real world environments to be able to enforce?
Yes.
Yeah.
And right before that, I just want to also piggyback on something that John said that made me think of an issue that we had when we were doing assessments that happens fairly often. And that's a company spent a lot of time figuring out how they want to present their CUI assets in an assessment and how they're protecting those. But one of the first things that the assessors are going to do, if they're doing it right, when they come in to look at what you've presented them with, is to compare your network diagram to your CUI data flow diagram and try to figure out how much of the environment outside of the CUI boundary might have access. And so it's not just about keeping access closed on this environment, it's about making sure that the rest of the environment is closed out as well. So when you were talking about making sure that unauthorized devices don't have access, that's what made me think of it. That happens a lot, that it's really hard for companies to show that the rest of their network does not have access to the CUI boundary sometimes.
Yeah, if it's in the same environment, it's so hard to segment in a way that to keep those people out of scope. So we see a lot of folks that have 1099s on staff, but they're non-CUI users, and I'll see ton of people saying, "Well, these are only 3 CUI users, really," but the other 25 people are in the environment, so they could technically have access to CUI. So you need to have a lot of blockers and preparedness for your assessor to explain how that's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, so thank you for the question, Stuart. And it's really important because almost every breach starts with some sort of access control or some sort of access that bypasses a control. 80% of breaches start with stolen credentials. So that alone tells you that this is a really important topic. And this is the number one um, attack sector globally that trying to impersonate someone, trying to collect their credentials, trying to figure out a way to act as a process that has access to an application. It's foundational. Keeping bad things out is foundational to all other security controls. And I said early on, it's worth repeating, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Of course, we need to be able to detect things when they uh, do happen, and bad things do happen, but preventing them from happening in the first place is the best bang for your buck in terms of information security, in my opinion. So, um, IAM is foundational for security, and that's demonstrated by the fact that it anchors a number of security frameworks. So it's foundational to the NIST frameworks, to CMMC, to HIPAA, to PCI, to GDPR, just, protect things from happening. And then as we've discussed, defining who and what has access and trying to protect the attack surface as best as you can. In CMMC, one of the things that companies wrestle with is what is the boundary going to be, and can they make the boundary smaller? And you might engage someone who will help you reduce the CUI boundary as much as possible. That's one of the best investments that you can make, because the smaller the attack surface, the less expensive it's going to be to protect it, the less you have to worry about a lot of expenses and excuse me, and credential attacks are silent. So a successful breach of credentials is not going to be easily detected. And that's another reason why it's really important. IAM is hard because there are tens of thousands of humans and machine IDs, and privilege creep happens for a reason. As we mentioned, we want to make things as easy as possible to make things happen, and too many people have privilege access in companies. Usually, there's often shadow IT, as John was talking about, remote work and mobile devices, and locking down not only corporate network devices, but home devices and mobile devices that have unique systems in terms of how they're accessed, and they often have greater physical access to them and that sort of thing. So, obviously, when it fails and people get in, then it's a lot harder to recoup the information that we are trying to protect. So, I will stop there unless one of you.
And isn't a big part of identity management, go into the area of identity proofing, that you really are who you are. So I think of the analogy of kind of the process that organizations are going through. It's like getting, what is it, a real ID for your system to prove that you actually are who you say you are before you're given kind of access to go through TSA, so to speak.
Yeah, and biometrics are getting easier to hack too. So, we're going to run out of eyeballs and fingertips soon.
And I assume
Sometimes
that.
the analog remains a good way. Like, for instance, we require everybody that comes on board with us to pick up their laptop in person. Every new hire has to come in at least once prior to starting, which is an analog way of doing it, but it's also kind of a foolproof way of doing it if you have the person in front of you and you can compare it. So.
That's
I think that's
we're just talking about that this morning in a meeting that we feel like that should become an important part of the way that we onboard people as well.
I mean, with AI and deepfakes, it's just
Uh,
I've seen videos of people completing interviews. The DPRK thing that we were talking about at the beginning of this, and it's astounding. Totally AI individual is just talking right back during the interview, and so sometimes you have to go old school.
yeah, for sure.
Exactly. It's certainly getting harder and harder. So, John, but like we saw when we looked at access control, we saw some of these issues addressed in the AC domain. And where do we see the things that Amy was just talking about addressed in the IA domain of NIST 800-171? Can you show us kind of the where and how within NIST 800-171?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's one thing that Amy talked about that I don't think I touched on in AC, but I think is extremely important. And it was the privilege creep. We talked about onboarding and how that has to be a structured process, but the even more important of a structured process is that offboarding, because if you have a new user that hasn't been onboarded properly, they're going to let you know that they don't have access. But if you offboard a user and you don't offboard all their access, nobody's going to come yelling at you because they can't get into something. So it's a very important thing to take a detailed approach on. But yeah, so IA is really about unique identification for all users at the top. And this is one that does trip up a lot of people I've seen because more and more we're getting into individual accounts and people are used to having their own accounts, but there's almost always a situation at each client I work with where they would at least like to use some sort of shared account. Whether it's IT at Acme Company or, accounting at Acme Company. And to be clear, distribution groups, that's fine. You can have an email address saying that distributes the email, but we're talking about user accounts that different people have access to. So multiple people logging into that same account. The best way I can always related, at least from a CMMC point of view, is that most of NIST 871, when you really boil it down, is about from the identification part at least, is about tracking back activities to individuals. So you need to be able to pull an audit log that says unequivocally this person did this at this time in this place. And that's just something, using a shared account, it immediately takes out that ability. You can't pin it down to a single person. The stronger authentication mechanisms, and this is one that we're thankfully getting a lot more used to. A couple of years ago, all the MFA and complex passwords were really a headache for a lot of people because we weren't used to them, but they are required. If you've never seen one of those graphs that show you the time it takes to break a password, that will almost immediately tell you why, or show you why you need to have things like MFA or SSO and things like that configured. Even a complex password can be broken in a matter of time. So having that secondary, whether it's a passkey or MFA in place is really important. MFA, now, while you really want to worry about it for your privileged accounts and remote access to standard accounts, my recommendation is always implement everywhere it can be implemented. Because again, passwords are easily broken, even complex ones in most cases. So having a secondary tier there will help you. The other reason is, even with complex passwords, and I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, even if just briefly, is there's always been a best practice to not reuse passwords for the same account. So you're not using your work password for your gym login or your DoorDash login, but let's be honest, a lot of people will do that anyway. Password managers are getting better, so people are able to use those more, but realistically, people are always going to use the same password on multiple different accounts because it's what they know. Not that it's right, but it's going to happen. So MFA kind of helps put that added level of protection against even that. So if that credential is breached, they still have that way to protect you. And then there's the device authentication. The devices itself, because whatever device, you're not the only one connecting to the environment. Your device is also connecting in there, and everything that is on your device is technically connecting in as well. So having that device authentication can make, ensures that the devices connecting are those that you trust, those that have a minimum baseline or benchmark, those that are offering the kind of protection that's required and that you've set out and outlined for your environment. And lastly, cryptographic protections. FIPS 140-2 is something that makes most people, start to feel a headache. I know it's been a big thing, especially for the first few years of CMMC. But the good news is most places are offering that level of encryption now. And when we talk about things that are how bad actors are engaging in these environments, how they're attacking them, having the best encryption available or at least validated is a primary defense. Again, you don't want to have the house door locked that everybody has a key to. So, IA, while it's really about the users and the devices and protecting those passwords and that access, it melds very nicely into AC, giving us that IAM we were talking about earlier.
So, John, can you just kind of give us quickly some pointers on how we put this all into practice?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is scope and resources, right? So, what are you looking at your entirety of your scope? Understanding, a very good network diagram is essential. So you understand because you could have, a Microsoft GCC or GCC high environment, and then put in your access controls and do it to a T. But then you also have three other environments that you're working in, whether it's AWS or Salesforce, whatever, and you don't have those connected or you don't have the same type of rules in place, then you're only partially protected at best. But starting with that scope, understanding everything that's included and how you can best put all those things together. Anything that you can integrate with SSO and things like that will help ease your administrative overhead process. But having the sitting down and doing everybody's favorite thing, which is writing policies or developing policies with these controls in mind and your business, excuse me, your business and business practices, more importantly, as the target, are very important. I know a lot of people go to taking that, grabbing a template and just slapping their name on it. But then you're allowing that template to dictate how you do business. And that I've never seen that work one-to-one. Usually there's quite a bit of customization that needs to happen. So it seems like an extra thing. It seems like something that's real pain to do, but I promise you it's very important and it will change how easily your environment is managed moving forward. And then using those policies and procedures to outline and then push out the technical configurations associated, making sure that what you've defined is what gets rolled out and having that second set of eyes check over your work, peer review processes. And then the other part, I think we're still trying to break people of CMMC is that it's not a one-stop solution. It's a continued compliance and technical management process. So making sure that all of your ongoing processes like onboarding and offboarding are very well detailed, very well understood by your staff, and very well executed on is key. Because if you get everything perfect and then a couple minutes later, somebody's not following the process, all of your work could be for naught at that point.
Okay. And I know while we've talked about the ultimate objective of why you're doing this is security, and it's safeguarding our systems from people who falsely pose as legitimate U.S. employees and ensuring that people who have been proved and authorized only have access to the information they're entitled to. But contractors still need to achieve CMMC certification to be contract eligible, and that still kind of remains a focus. So, Amy, let me ask you, in order to achieve a CMMC certification, can you help us understand what an assessor is going to look at or look for when assessing the AC control domain, and what should an OSA do to be prepared for that assessment?
Yeah, thanks. I had to smile when John was talking about everybody's favorite thing, policies, but saying what you do and then doing what you say is really important. So define policies and evidence that they are consistently enforced. Oh, there are rookie assessors out there that love to do things like look at the policy and how often are you reviewing this, and it says that you review it once a year and it's now been 15 months. And so little things like that can be really important to assessors. And again, that's the kind of stuff that people say, well, that's not really helping me be more secure. That's a compliance checkbox. And I agree with that. But it's still important to do what you say and say what you do. And so spending the time to write a policy that you can follow and follow effectively, and making sure that you've got someone assigned to review that in a timely manner, and that they do it when they say they're going to do it and when it's expected to be done, and all of those sorts of things. And then it also correct implementation of your technical controls and that they are effectively monitored related to all these things that we've been talking about, access controls and identity management and and that they apply to the CUI boundary, and that anything outside of that scope is not creeping into the environment in any way. Common evidence for access controls are access request tickets, privileged user lists, multi-factor authentication, enforcement proof, what your RBAC matrix looks like, evidence that you're updating your user lists, that all of those, the snippets of all the things that you say that you're doing and all the controls that you're putting in place. And it's still something that comes into play every once in a while that people don't necessarily understand, that the assessors are not just looking at 110 controls, they're looking at 320 objectives. And there are 6 objectives for the first access control. So if you miss one of those objectives, you meet 5 objectives, but you miss the 6th one, you miss the whole entire control. And so it's really important to understand that that's where the assessor's view is going to be, is at that objective level. So it's 320 things within 110 things that the assessors are looking at. And once you've focused on those objectives and you feel like you've put together effective artifacts and evidence against each of those objectives, I would also say, again, I'm going to back up and add another point, is that it's really important to have evidence that speaks to what you're doing. So read the objectives carefully, put together artifacts that map to that objective effectively. Don't add a whole lot of extra fluff. If you're on the fence and you think there's another artifact or two that might be relevant to that objective, then go ahead and add that. But I actually talked to an assessor a few months ago who said they failed a whole company because they had too many artifacts, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think it's your job to see whether or not the artifacts meet the controls and the controls are met. But know that it makes you look like you aren't really telling a compelling story. And so, for the last 2 companies that I worked for before I came to FutureFeed, we use FutureFeed to help organize information because it does a really effective job of storytelling. And when I'm advising clients for CMMC, one of the things that I tell them is kind of jokingly, your job is to tell such a compelling story that you don't really even have to talk to the assessors. So you have a, best case scenario, a snippet of a policy that addresses the objective and a snippet of a process related to a technical control. And then you write a sentence or two that states this control is met or this objective is met through these 2 things that we have in place. And at the bottom of the screen here is just an example of a summary statement that you might have after you've addressed all of the objectives, then having a clear summary statement for the control itself that summarizes how each of the objectives related to the control are met. Telling that story effectively and concisely, I think is one of the best things that you can do towards having a successful CMMC assessment.
And Amy, I know you referred to documentation, policies, procedures, objective evidence, but in the course of the assessment, isn't the assessor going to come and actually test some of these things? They're going to try to demonstrate or look at trying to access a privileged application from a non-privileged user and so forth. And what other sorts of things might an assessor try to test to validate compliance with these requirements?
Yeah, they might test any of your access controls that you have in place, and more than likely they're going to ask you to do it. So they'll shoulder surf or ask you to pull up something if it's part of a virtual assessment and demonstrate that something works effectively. And you want to make sure, another important tip is that you want to make sure that whoever you put in place for answering those questions is ready for answering those questions. They are cognizant of the applications that are likely going to be reviewed, and they have practiced um, checking themselves to make sure that anything that shouldn't happen doesn't happen in that evaluation.
Right. I think that that's great advice that, people in assessment prep, should ensure that they're able to demonstrate each of the things that they've implemented and that they've recorded in their SSP, and that somebody can speak to it and essentially in an interview describe what appears in the SSP. The consistency is really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And going through that fully, I can't vouch for that enough. I mean, the last thing you ever want to do is say, yeah, see, no standard users can install programs. Let him show you. And then he goes to show you and it installs right away. So during your prep, actually going through and acting like you're being assessed with your team, making sure all those interviewees know exactly what's going to happen. Can't say enough for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've long said that people can go through the process and satisfy all of the requirements, but still not be prepared for the assessment. And assessment prep is important to be able to get through the assessment, but it's also just kind of a great way of validating that, in fact, all of those requirements, all 320 assessment objectives that Amy referred to, have been compliantly addressed by your organization, and that you can demonstrate it, and that you can speak to it, and that you can show it in the evidence and the documentation. So I know we've covered a lot today, and John, Amy, thank you both for an informative discussion. Just let me summarize, the kind of, I think, the key points that we've heard. One, every breach begins with unauthorized access in some form, and your objective needs to be to guard against unauthorized access. Access control that we've talked about determines who or what is allowed into a system and what they can do or see once they're inside your system. Identity management determines who you are by managing and verifying your digital identity. It's kind of that again, special ID card. Fourth, the two of those work together. IA control, establish your identity. AC uses that identity to decide what you're permitted to access. Access control is the front line of CMMC. It is the domain that is typically the first and is the most heavily scrutinized during a CMMC assessment. And finally, identity and access management must address more than just people. It has to look at all of the non-human processes and systems that are involved. A number of people have asked in the questions. We will be sharing a copy of the slides, and we will be providing a link in an email to the replay of that. With that, before we get to questions, let me remind you to sign up for future episodes of our Future Feed Explorers webinar series. And you can also see past episodes on our YouTube channel. You can access them directly from the Future Feed website. So we've got time probably for a few questions. John, maybe one for you. For companies with a virtual workforce connecting to a GCC high environment, is the GCC high environment considered the environment that is being accessed remotely?
Yeah, yeah, and so it is, but I will caveat that by saying I've seen different interpretations from different assessors, and the key determination is how your endpoints are connected to it. So, GCC High, they support an end-to-end at FIPS 140-2 encryption tunnel with all of the connected devices, but you want to make sure you're not just connecting your laptop, like signing into Outlook, and that's call it a day. These need to be intra and preferably Intune joined devices, so they're truly connected to that cloud environment in order for it to really not be considered a fully remote connection. That being said, even as a considered remote connection, the FIPS validated tunnel that I was referring to covers you for most of that.
Okay. And a related question somebody had then, for a virtual workforce or remote workforce accessing GCC High, is a VPN required from the corporate network?
Not if there's not already one in place. Like if I'm reading that as a virtual workforce, meaning that there probably isn't a full corporate headquarters in play. There are some benefits if you do have a corporate headquarters anyway, and maybe that CUI, we'll call it staff for that environment, is remote to doing that. But if you don't have a corporate headquarters, you're a remote workforce, there's no need to implement a corporate firewall and VPN just for that connection. Entra and Intune will take care of that for you as long as everything is joined correctly.
Very good. And so, Amy, let me throw, I think, this last question. Is one concerning operational technology or OT? And we know that the scope of CMMC is IT rather than OT. And I'm going to paraphrase individual says AC is easy in a Windows-based office environment. It's more difficult when considering OT. What do we recommend for organizations to ensure the same levels of identity and access control for engineering and manufacturing environments with OT? Any pointers there that you can share?
It depends on the OT and how it's set up, but I mean, a common problem is having CNC machines that are needed for both commercial and defense related work in an open environment. And how do you go about managing credentials related to that? And, printers, keeping them in a locked closet. And sometimes it's a function of making it really clear that there's a lock on the device. But honestly, it depends on the OT cameras. It's another whole separate conversation around the cameras and whether or not they can see CUI clearly. So it really depends. Unfortunately, that's a terrible answer. It depends, but it does depend on the OT that you're talking about and what would be required to lock it down.
Well, great. Well, Amy and John, thank you again. I want to let everybody who's watching know that we are all committed to helping organizations within the DIB better understand and capable of satisfying their obligations under CMMC. Please feel free to reach out to any of us after this if you do have questions, if we can be a resource and help you as you go along your CMMC journey. And as I said, we will be sending an email with a link both to a copy of the slides and to the replay. And with that, I want to thank everybody who's joined us today for your time. And Amy, John, thank you.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you so much.